Continuing on my patho-PEC kick, I was looking at a study. Actually, I was looking for the role of the glutes, glute max, and well, I was really thinking glute max, but then glute medius, you really can't separate the two, as you'll see. The role of the glutes during gait and when they're most active, okay? So I'm just gonna end the study. Actually, I don't remember what, it was from the 90s or the 80s, but timing and relative intensity of hip extensor and abductor muscle action during level and stair walking. So they were looking at the timing of when the muscles would start to kick in and the intensity at which they would kick in during hip extension, which would be, so if the pelvis is forward, so if the pelvis is forward, that's flexion of the hip. Extension is when the pelvis gets pulled back. That's what we need when we're in a left AIC pattern. That left pelvis needs to come back. The right side needs to come forward. But if you're a PEC or patho-PEC, meaning both sides of the pelvis is forward, you need the pelvis to come backwards, hip extension on both sides, okay? So just realize that someone who's a patho-PEC, they're walking very oddly. This is them walking. They're not doing this at all. They're waddling and their butt's trying to go back and forth to provide movement that they can't get. And they cannot rotate through the spine. So I'm just going to read out some data that I found in the actual study. First, it's the wrong page, it's the second page. So there's something called loading response phase, and that's when the heel hits the ground. So if you ever watch my videos, I'm always talking about heel strike, left heel strike. Left heel strike initiates the left pelvis being brought back into extension. Remember, a lot of pelvises are flexed forward, hip flexion. We're talking about extension. We need to extend the pelvis backwards so the rest of the body can get out of extension. Okay, so at loading response, that's right at initial heel strike. At that point, the adductor, ADD ductor, your inner thigh, and the lower glute max, so the bottom of the glute, all the way, well, it would be kind of like this. So the bottom part of the glute max peak during loading response. So at heel strike, and then the first maybe 10% of your foot being on the ground would be loading response. That's when the adductor and the lower glute max are the most active. And actually, at that point in time, you have 2 feet on the ground. So your heel is hitting the ground, but you're of the front foot, but on the back foot, the big toe is still on the ground. So you're in a 2-legged support position at that point in time. But on that front foot at heel strike during loading response, the adductor and the lower glute max are at their peak activity. Now, what makes that interesting? Well, when you're in the left AIC pattern, most people will feel their weight towards the right heel. What do you also find? You find that they have overly tight right adductor, inner thigh, and also quite often the lower glute max area, the posterior, lower fibers of the glute max often have to be, I'm not gonna say often, but they're often, I just said often again, they can be tight and sometimes they need to be inhibited, stretched out, so that this right leg can regain proper range of motion, okay? So that was interesting. Okay, so now also the hamstrings. Well, let's just talk about the left hamstring. The left hamstring are active during swing phase. So they stop your left leg. So if you're on your right leg and the left leg is swinging through the air, the hamstrings are going to stop that progression of the thigh. So the left leg has to be slowed down and stopped, and the hamstrings are going to do that. And then the heel hits the ground. Now the other thing is they prevent excessive knee extension as the heel hits the ground. Something you often see is that when people are standing, especially if they're pathological, they're standing with their knees locked, and it looks like their knees are almost behind them. You see that even more often on the left, and at that point, you know that hamstring is not doing any of its job. It's not stopping the thigh from going forward, and it's not stopping excessive extension of the knee at heel strike. So people are basically living with a hyperextended left knee. And that, you know, that left hamstring is out of commission. All right, so, but that can be, for patho-PECs, that could be happening on both sides. You'll see them standing and both knees are locked out, and you'll see their knees, when they're standing, it's like their pelvis is like this and their knees are behind them. They are ungrounded, very ungrounded. Continuing, the glute max and the glute med, so the glute max and the glute med, they peak during the initial 10% of stance phase. So after heel contact, when you're moving into stance phase, and stance phase is when the other leg is actually in the air, so you're only on one leg. That's when the glute and the glute medius peak to stabilize you in stance phase. The glutes cannot be, you will never stabilize a pelvis without proper glute strength and without proper glute medius strength. They also, however, the glute max and the glute medius, the upper part, so the lower part of the glute max is more involved in stance, stabilizing you in stance. The upper part of the glute max and the glute medius work to abduct the right leg, or well, either leg. They work to abduct the leg, and they help position that leg during the swing phase. So you have these glutes, not only do they stabilize you in stance phase when the leg is on the ground, but then they also provide the abduction needed to swing the leg through the air and make sure that that leg swing stabilizes that side of the pelvis, or retains the correct position. So they're working non-stop. They're doing so many important things. You need the hamstrings, obviously. And the hamstrings, interestingly, they have less an effect at the knee. Most of their effectiveness comes from stopping flexion of the hip forward. So that value is more at the hip, stopping flexion of the hip and then pulling it back, which we know. So we got to pull that pelvis back into extension. The point is really more than the hamstrings at this point. I'm really focusing on the glute max and the glute medius and the various roles that they play for stabilization and then setting the leg up for leg swing. They have to work in both of those situations. And here's the thing, people who are patho-PEC, they are not going to, their legs will be abducted and externally rotated already. So their glutes are not in a position to contract forcefully because they're probably, they'll be shortened in that position. So they're kind of out of commission. Their butts are pinched and small and they atrophy because they're never really being used. Calves are being used quite often. What else you're going to be using? You have no frontal plane. I was talking about the frontal plane yesterday. At this point, you have no frontal plane because your legs are so externally rotated and abducted, and you just kind of waddle. But what are you going to use to push from side to side? Quads. You're going to use quads, the vastus lateralis on both sides, to kind of just try to shift you back and forth as you walk. So a lot of people are going to have bigger quads and very tight vastus lateralis quads, and probably the rectus femoris quad as well. The other thing, and I kind of forgot oh yeah, okay, so now, here you are, you got a PEC. You need glutes to posteriorly tilt that pelvis with the hamstrings. You need glutes then to be used for proper transverse and frontal plane activity. So they need to be able to frontal plane abduction, and they need to push you to the opposite side, and that would be that leg would externally rotate to do that. So they're hugely important in the sagittal plane, frontal plane, and transverse. They're important in all three planes. Glutes are so important. So you can say, all right, I'm just going to do some glute exercises. That should work, right? Negative. Why? Because you're forgetting what's on top. You have to control, all these muscles we're talking about are below the inlet. This is called the inlet of the pelvis. All these muscles we're talking about right now, and all the muscles they were studying in this study, are below the inlet. So you're just, with those muscles, you're just trying to control down here. What's controlling up here? What if you can't control up here? How will that affect what's going on down here? Well, up top we got this rib cage. And most PECs, if they're forward on both sides of the pelvis, their spine, here's the front, here's the back, here's the rib cage, is going to be extended. And once these ribs pop up and these ribs flare out, you lose your abdominals. You have no control. And where do the abdominals, where do the internal obliques and transverse abdominis attach? Pelvis. You need them also to pull that pelvis back. So people are living like this. That's how they're walking around. Hamstrings and glutes are not going to be enough. You're going to need obliques as well through exhalation, because if you can't exhale fully, these ribs will not come down and you can't get that system into flexion. At that point, now you've reestablished neutrality of a system, the entire system, and maybe the neck also. And at that point, you start to retrain all this frontal plane stuff that you've lost. It's not enough. That's why just working on glutes and glute mediuses and hamstrings for knee issues is not always going to work, because the influence of the upper body, it's just going to pull you into extension again. If you never address what's going on up here, you're never going to get this pelvis out of an extended position. They know, yeah, you need these glutes. You need the glute medius, hamstring, and they know that because they're talking about knee pain also. They know that, but they're not considering up here. If this is still extended, if this lower spine is still extended and these rib cage is still up, and you don't have any control over the inlet of the pelvis because their abs are completely shut down, nothing is going to stick. So you have to get abs also to help posteriorly tilt that pelvis, bring it back into neutrality, and now you can start to establish the frontal plane again. But only trying to do glute exercises or hamstring exercises to deal with any type of joint is never going to work, because you're not addressing the upper body also. Well, it might help a little bit, but it's never going to resolve the issue long term until you get proper position of the rib cage also, because they're connected by the spine. They're not separate. It's all one system. So I had something else that I wanted to say about, can you just do sit-ups and crunches and all that? Not really. Because you have to position, it also has to involve the actual breathing mechanism, because 23,000 times a day you're going to be breathing. So you have to position the pelvis and the rib cage like in a hands and knees breathing. You might want to check that one out on the website, right? I put it there for a reason. That posteriorly tilts the pelvis, that flexes the spine, the whole system goes into flexion. Now you're in a position, if you start breathing properly, now you're in a position for all the muscles to kick in properly. Position determines whether those muscles will work or not. If you do planks and you're extended, you're not changing a thing. Do side planks and you're extended, you're not changing a thing. You're just reinforcing the poor position, the dysfunctional position that's causing pain to begin with. So you have to round to posteriorly tilt the pelvis and bring the spine forward. Well, actually, no, the spine's gonna move back. The rib cage has to come down, and then breathe, and you will expand everything properly, and you will decompress the body. You will feel better. And then you have to really work on that frontal plane, which I was talking about yesterday, which is adduction and abduction on both sides.